trying to do any kind of makeup in this heat is a terrible idea. I can't work out what's skincare and what's sweat. I really need to come up with some better intros for these videos because that was just gross. Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, my name is Hazel Jane, and today we are back with another episode of Monsters, Myths and Makeup, which is a little series that I have where we get to delve into the weird and wonderful world of monsters and myths, whilst I attempt to bring these stories to life through a makeup look inspired by the creatures behind the legends. If you're interested in mythology and or makeup, I would recommend hitting subscribe because that basically covers a lot of what I do. If you are already subscribed, thank you. Feel free to leave a like if you enjoy the video. The last couple of episodes I've done in like the voiceover style so that you can see the full process of the makeup look. We are going back to our roots today and doing more of like a talk whilst makeuping thing. There's definitely a better way that I could have put that, but you know what I mean. Quick shout out and thank you to my patrons for helping me decide on this week's topic, and to be fair, last episodes as well. If you're interested in having a bit of input in the kind of topics that you want me to cover and the content that you want to see, as well as some behind the scenes stuff and sneak previews, early access, that kind of thing, I'll leave a link to my Patreon in the description box down below. Right, now all the self-promo stuff is out the way. Myths. Last episode, we looked into the evolution of the somewhat lesser-known Harpy mythology of Finland. But this week, we are delving back into mainstream mythology with everybody's favourite, the ancient Greeks. Specifically, to look at a creature that actually has quite a few sort of parallels and crossovers with the Greek sirens, or like the original version of the sirens, not the mermaid confused type. And that is the monstrous harpy. I've been fascinated with harpies for quite a while. They're a really interesting topic to me. I knew they were like generally considered very hideous, monstrous creatures, but there's a lot more that goes into them and like their mythology than I realised, which I understand is a fairly generic statement that you could probably apply to basically any form of mythology, but you know what I mean. But before we dive into the actual story and the legend and the myth, let me go get prepped and ready and sorted. So grab a Red Bull, grab a monster, grab a seat, and let's go. For those of you who are interested in the makeup side of things, I will leave links to all the products that I use in the description box down below. As always as well, I will apologise in advance for any and all errors in pronunciation of words, names, places. A lot of my research goes into ancient history and it covers a lot of different areas in the world. Some of the words that I come across are really hard to say. I do always try my best to pronounce them correctly, but please feel free to correct me in the comments if I do get them wrong. So first things first, what is a harpy? Now, originating in Greek and Roman mythology, a harpy is a hybrid creature, half human, half bird. And the majority of the time, it was half woman, half bird. The hybrid nature of the creature was most often described as being like a bird that then had the head and sometimes the torso of a woman. In some cases, it was a beautiful, young, fair maiden, and other times a vile old hag. Such seems to be the duality of any female-based mythical creatures. Sirens, succubus, banshees. Now, the type of bird that they were associated with is quite important because whilst it wasn't necessarily one particular species of bird, it leaned a lot more into the sort of birds of prey side of things rather than pretty little songbirds or anything like that. The Roman poet Ovid actually described harpies as human vultures, just to give you an idea of the kind of vibe they were going for. And there was a lot of emphasis placed on their insatiable hunger, which often led to them being depicted with these really pale, quite gaunt looking faces. Alongside this, one of the other most sort of accepted details about their appearance was that they had these huge, talons on their hands. Would it be feet? Hands? Sometimes they had hands, sometimes it was just bird legs. Now, whilst there are many examples of the harpies being described as these birds with the heads of beautiful, fair maidens, and in some cases they have a really alluring song to them, the majority of records do refer to them as being these really foul-natured, hideous, just vile, ugly creatures. The ancient epic poet Hesiod, who we have delved into his work quite a few times now, he definitely leaned more into the sort of beautiful maiden variant of the harpy, describing them as the harpies of the lovely hair who could fly as fast as the winds themselves. If you look a little later than Hesiod at the work of Aeschylus, I believe is how it's pronounced, the Greek playwright often considered the father of tragedy, which, side note on its own, that's quite a cool title. Harpies were described as ugly creatures with wings, and then as time passed, this notion of them being ugly grew a lot stronger, to the point where later writers would use the harpy basically to represent like the most disgusting of all the monsters. Which, if I remember correctly, was how the Gorgons and like Medusa were treated as well. I don't know, man, it just feels like the Greeks hated women. Okay, this is turning out a bit more blue than I meant it to. Although there's actually quite an interesting comparison within Aeschylus's work, in which the Harpies and the Gorgons are like described alongside each other in terms of just how sort of hideous and monstrous they both are. And in turn, both of them are then used in comparison for the Erinyes, which is the chthonic, I believe, goddesses of vengeance. Now, I did have to look it up, so chthonic basically just means deities or spirits who lived within the underworld. So like Hades, Demeter, and Persephone when she was like queen of the underworld. Now, naturally, there were many adaptations and variations on the exact appearance of the Harpies throughout ancient Greek writings. For example, Virgil described them as bird-bodied, girl-faced things with abominable droppings, talons on their hands, and a face haggard by insatiable hunger. I have to admit, when I was doing my research and I've read bird-bodied, girl-faced things, I don't know, there was just something really amusing about how, like, unpoetic that description was. Interestingly, there were some writers who described the Harpies with, like, the opposing hybrid, if that makes sense. So, Hyginus, I think it's pronounced. So Hyginus described them as being feathered with like the head and wings of a cockerel, but then they had human arms with these great big claws on the end of it, but then they had like the body, chest, stomach, and genitalia of a human woman. Now, the Harpies weren't just these like ugly, foul-natured creatures. They actually played quite a significant role in the world of the gods. So Harpies were believed to have originally been a form of wind spirit, and more specifically, they were a spirit that personified the destructive nature of wind. And the name Harpy actually means snatchers or swift robbers. Their behaviours fall on a scale somewhere between stealing their victim's food whilst they attempted to eat it, kind of like a seagull, all the way through to stealing the victim themselves and carrying them off like an eagle. During ancient Greek times, it was believed that if a person sort of disappeared from Earth, they'd actually been taken and carried off by the Harpies. And in this... that was a bit too much powder. So in that capacity, they were known as being these like agents of punishment who were known for kidnapping and abducting their victims and then basically torturing them as they carried them off to a place called Tartarus. I think that's how it's pronounced. So Tartarus is basically just this like big, deep abyss where souls are judged after death, and it is where the wicked would receive their like divine punishment following their judgment. It's considered almost like an eternal dungeon of torture, but it also serves as a prison for the Titans. So I mean, for that fact alone, it's got to be pretty big. Because whilst the Harpies themselves were depicted as these like vicious, cruel, violent creatures, their victims were, for the most part, evil people, wrongdoers, and in particular it was people who had killed or murdered members of their own family. As such, the Harpies became known as these like agents of punishment on behalf of the gods. And in some of the mythology surrounding them, they were actually even referred to as the Hounds of Zeus, or sorry, the Hounds of mighty Zeus. I'm sorry, I'm convinced that Zeus has like the biggest and most fragile ego. But yeah, they were basically listed or described as acting as these agents of punishment on behalf of gods like Zeus, and in some cases they actually became described as some of the guardians of the underworld, among other creatures such as like the Gorgons, the Chimera, the Hydra, and surprisingly enough, centaurs, who I knew came from like Greek mythology, but I didn't know their association was with like the underworld. I thought centaurs were nice. That's one for a future episode. Something that I have found within Greek mythology, specifically looking into these kind of like mythological monsters, their family trees can get incredibly complicated because it seems that every single mythical creature has some form of lineage or parentage that traces back to various different like gods and deities, and it's all very interlinked and so confusing. Now, amongst all of the mythology that references the Harpies, there's no like single agreed upon family tree for them. Hesiod stated that they were the daughters of the sea god Thomas? It looks like Thomas but with an A. And the Oceanid Electra, who is sometimes called Ozemene? I desperately need someone to teach me how to pronounce like all of the Greek mythology names because they're so hard. Other writers have claimed that their father was the monstrous serpent Typhon, while others state they are the daughters of Pontus and Gaia, a pre-Olympian sea god and the ancestral mother. Although I did find some sources that listed the Harpies as being the daughters of Poseidon, which would that technically make them like nieces to Medusa? One thing I did find interesting is just how many like bird-related creatures were actually associated with sea deities in ancient Greece. Because I found this when I was researching into like the sirens as well, because obviously they were originally more like bird hybrids, but again, they both had links to like the seas and the oceans. I wonder, for the Harpies at least, whether it's more specifically to do with like the associations of storms and storm weather, because obviously Harpies are considered the personification of the destructive nature of wind, and obviously back at that time the oceans in particular were considered these huge destructive like raw forces of nature. And you know, you do like storms that you get out at sea are crazy. So yeah, maybe it's less to do with them being linked to like the sea and the ocean itself, and maybe it's more of a link along with like a storm at sea. I don't know, let me know what you think on that, because it's a weird one that keeps coming up. Now, as we have discovered before with ancient Greek mythology in particular, there are usually numerous stories and myths that include any particular given creature, some of which sort of contradict each other in terms of their details, others tell alternative versions of the same story or like alternative origin stories, that kind of thing. But like with the whole family tree thing, it does mean that there's usually quite a lot of confusing names and family associations to try and cover, so I'm going to apologise in advance because as always with ancient Greek, I'm about to throw a whole load of names at you, so I'll do my best to try and keep it as simplified and easy to follow as I can, but... So one of the first myths that I came across about the Harpies was the story of King Pandarius, I think, and his daughters. Weird little side note about old King Pandarius, he was said to have been favoured by the goddess Demeter, who granted him the benefit of never suffering from indigestion no matter how much food he ate. I honestly couldn't find the context in which that was relevant, but it was just too weirdly fascinating to not include. King Pandarius was friends with a man called Tantalus, who was actually most sort of famous for the punishment that he ended up receiving in Tartarus. And again, slight kind of side note on this because it's quite fascinating, and yeah, it's kind of relevant. So Tantalus's his crimes vary depending on like what sources you read and what myths you read, but his punishment was being made to stand in a pool of water with a fruit tree that hung over him with like low-hanging branches. But the fruit that grew on this tree was always like just out of reach for him to be able to get, and whenever he would try and take a drink from the water, it would recede before he could get to it. So his eternal punishment was like not being able to get the food or the water, despite it being right there in front of him. So this actually led to the proverb of Tantalaian punishment, which was used by the ancient Greeks to reference people who like had nice things but were unable to experience them. And in case you hadn't put it together, it is the origin of the English word tantalize, which means to like be tormented with the sight of something that is desired but out of reach. Now, anyway, Tantalus was generally considered a very wicked figure, and he requested that King Pandarius steal a golden dog from a sacred place for him. However, this golden dog belonged to none other than Zeus. It was not just a golden dog in a sacred place, it was actually the dog that had guarded Zeus as an infant by the will of his mother. So, fairly important to him. And as we have said many a time, Zeus was not exactly known for being the forgiving type. So after Pandarius stole his dog, Zeus just went full John Wick and ordered for the dog to be returned and for the thieves to be punished. Now, after stealing it, Pandarius then gave the dog to his friend, but when said friend was questioned about the stolen dog, he claimed that he had never received it and basically had no involvement. Tantalus, you dick. As a result of this, Zeus just ended up turning Pandarius to stone where he stood, basically. Though other writers state that Pandarius tried to flee along with his wife, but that they both died in their attempts to escape because, is Zeus. Now, following the death of Pandarius and his wife, his daughters were taken in by Aphrodite, who, alongside, I think, Hera and Athena, basically helped to sort of raise them and teach them how to be proper women, and just generally sort of took care of them, similarly to how they did during the creation of Pandora. Now, at some point, Aphrodite approached Zeus about arranging marriages for these daughters. However, before she could then return to the daughters were said to have been carried off by storm winds to the underworld, which, of course, as the personification of these storm winds were the Harpies, who had carried the daughters off to become handmaids to the Erinyes. Or I think they're called the Furies, if you look at the Roman side of things comparatively to the Greek. I need to look into at some point why Roman and Greek mythology is the same stories but different names. If anyone could give me a really, really simplified explanation as to what that is all about, I'd appreciate it, because it gets really confusing because people use them interchangeably. Now, whilst the story of Pandarius and his daughters was the first myth that I saw about the harp, that wasn't meant to go there. The most well-known myth, and in fact the myth that all other accounts of the Harpies comes from, is the story of King Phineas of Thrace. And just for context, Thrace is a geographical and historical region in southeastern Europe, which today would have included parts of Bulgaria, Greece, and Turkey. Now, King Phineas appears in the accounts about the Argonauts' voyage, and depending on which source you read, the myth states that he was granted the gift of prophecy by either Apollo or by Zeus himself. Because, again, Zeus just has a hand in everything. I'm honestly getting kind of bored of reading about Zeus. Now, as always, there are a number of variations on the exact detailing of this myth, but the general sort of gist of this tale is that Phineas then angered the gods by using this gift of prophecy to reveal things that he shouldn't have to mankind. Now, as punishment for this action, Phineas was then blinded by Zeus, though some accounts state that Zeus actually asked him whether he would rather have a long life or keep his sight, to which Phineas said he would rather never see the sun than die. Some believe that, based on this particular statement, Helios, the god that personified the sun, didn't take too kindly to being so easily dismissed by Phineas, and as such, he sent the Harpies to torment him. But then other sources state that the Harpies' involvement was all part of Zeus's punishment because they were the dogs of Zeus in the first place. So again, it's kind of, I like the Helios side of things because it tailors in specifically to him saying he'd rather never see the sun, and then Helios being like, huh? That was such an eloquent way of putting it. But basically, Phineas, now blind, ends up on an island with these Harpies. Also on this island is an absolute abundance of food. But similar to the punishment of Tantalus, Phineas can never eat this food because either, as he goes to eat it, the Harpies will swoop in and steal it, either to eat it for themselves or to just stop him from eating it, or they would otherwise basically just like poop all over the food, therefore rendering it completely inedible. Now this punishment with the Harpies was, like most punishments in Greek mythology to be fair, an endless cycle until the arrival of Jason and the Argonauts. Now, upon witnessing the punishment that King Phineas was enduring, Jason and the Argonauts agreed to help him get rid of these Harpies if he would give them directions to assist them on their journey. Now, amongst the Argonauts were two brothers known as the Boreads, or Wind Brothers, and they were actually King Phineas's brothers-in-law, and they had the ability to fly. Now, Phineas told them that using his gift of prophecy, it was fate that they had arrived there, and that the Boreads in particular were fated to help him get rid of these Harpies. So, with much reassurance that the Boreads and the Argonauts would not be punished by the gods for interfering with the gods' punishment, they set up this trap for Phineas to try and eat some of the food that was there while the Boreads stood guard. So, when Phineas attempted to eat this food, obviously the Harpies swooped down to steal and or poop on it, at which point the Boreads then gave chase to the Harpies, and they chased after them basically as far as like the floating islands, and at this point the Boreads were stopped by either Hermes or Iris, again, depending which source you read. So Iris is actually the sister of the Harpies, just for context. But basically, whoever it was that they encountered commanded that the Boreads stop, and they promised that the Harpies would no longer bother Phineas as long as they let the Harpies live, basically. There are other accounts that states that the Boreads did actually end up, like, killing the Harpies, and then there are others that state that both the Harpies and the Boreads somehow died during this chase, but either way, it meant that Phineas was now free from his torment from them, at which point he then gave Jason all the information that he needed to continue on his journey. Interesting side note I realised on this, because obviously later on, Jason and the Argonauts encounter the Sirens, and is where they employed the bard Orpheus to help them pass. But the tale of Phineas and Jason and the Harpies is basically like kind of a parallel to the tale of Odysseus, Circe, and the Sirens in Odyssey. Odysseus ends up washing ashore on Circe's land, and admittedly it's a bit different because she turns all his men into like animals and tries to sleep with them, but eventually she ends up giving them the directions and telling them how to sort of get past the siren aspect of their journey. Similar to the Sirens, the Harpies have remained fairly popular in terms of sort of like modern day literature or just modern use in general. But they were especially popular during the Middle Ages. In Dante's Inferno, which is the first part of the 14th century epic poem Divine Comedy, Dante describes the 9 rings of hell, a series of concentric circles of like torment and punishment located within the earth, and it all culminates at the center of the earth with Satan himself. Now, the punishment within each of these rings is different, and each of them were essentially allocated to a sin, and the idea was that the punishment would fit the crime. Now, these circles represented a sort of gradual increase in like the wickedness of the sin, with the sort of lesser sins being cast into what is known as upper hell, and then the more serious punishments being dished out in lower hell. What's known as the upper hell is actually related to the 7 deadly sins, because essentially the punishments there are all based around the idea of someone who is unable to control their like urges or appetites or their own desires. Now, the 7th circle of hell is dedicated to the sin of violence, and it's split into like 3 rings. So ring 1 is violence against neighbours or other people. Ring 2 is violence against yourself, and then ring 3 is violence against God, art, and nature. I've just had to answer the door to the postman looking like this, so that was fun. Right, so back to hell. Hello, Editor Hazel stepping in for a moment here. Unfortunately, I made a bit of a boo-boo. I accidentally recorded a bit I was not meant to record, hence me just mindlessly looking around the screen for a while, and then didn't, in fact, record the bit that I was meant to. So allow me to fill you in. According to Dante, within hell, the 2nd round of the 7th circle is related to violence against yourself, and it's known as the Wood of Suicides. And it's where the souls of the people who had attempted to or successfully taken their own lives were transformed into gnarled and thorny trees. And these woods that were made of the souls of these people were absolutely infested with harpies, who would then spend eternity feeding on those trees. I need to do line work on my lips very quickly, so bear with me. Okay, now beyond these medieval associations with like hell and eternal punishment and bad things in general, the harpy does have a number of more modern uses as well. So similarly to the Leviathan and the extinct species of sperm whale, Leviathan, the harpy eagle is specifically named after the mythical creature. Okay, the lip is giving a bit more like goatee crow vibes than I'd intended it to. I mean, maybe if I do that it looks a bit more like a beak, but I wanted to give a bit more of like a editorial style shape to give like a pointy beak illusion. I don't know if that's worked or not. So in terms of like modern usage as well, the harpies have another similarity to like the sirens and the gorgons, in that harpy has become a term used metaphorically to refer to a loud, opinionated, or annoying, nasty woman. And one of the most famous examples of it being used in that context is actually in Shakespeare's Much Ado About Nothing. Again, it's an interesting theme I've noticed quite a lot with how sort of female-based mythical creatures have become associated with really, really like negative traits within women nowadays. So you've got things like the sirens, the succubus, the gorgons, the harpies, even things like Pandora. If you look at the proper origins, she was an earth goddess, but it got twisted and changed, and now Pandora is used as basically a figurehead for everything that is wrong in the world. Harpies also feature quite a lot in more sort of like mainstream pop culture, so, or at least references to them. So things like Game of Thrones, you have the Sons of the Harpy. Supernatural, obviously, have elements and references to harpies in them. And the surprisingly difficult fight in early game Baldur's Gate 3, which I went to way earlier than I should have and definitely died. The last thing we need to do is round up and have a little look at some of the comparative mythology, but I'm basically done with this, so let me just go do like the finishing touches and then I'll be back and we can follow up. Okay, I told myself I wasn't going to do anything too like face painty with this look. I was going to try and keep it a bit more pared back, more editorial style, but I think I'm pretty happy with how it's turned out. I think the white highlighting around these bits has definitely pulled it together a bit more. I'll explain my idea behind this look in a minute. Let's just finish talking about the harpies first. So we are now moving on to the comparative mythology of the harpies, which I found that because there's quite a lot of crossover between like harpies and the early renditions of the sirens, obviously both of which come from Greek mythology, a lot of the comparative mythology for each of them actually seems to overlap. So one of the legends that I saw that was linked to the harpy is the Slavic alkonost, which is a legendary woman-headed bird from Slavic folklore. Incredibly fascinating creature and sort of legend, and I went into a lot more detail about the legend of that creature in my video on the sirens, but again, because of the whole bird hybrid thing, it's one of the ones that is drawn quite closely to both harpies and sirens. Interestingly though, there's quite a high number of like creatures and figures from like East Asian mythology that share certain features or appearances with the Harpies, such as the Karura from Japan. So the Karura is basically kind of like an inverse of the Harpy. It's a divine creature with wings, a human torso, and a bird-like head. And it's said to be absolutely enormous. It breathes fire, and their diet consists of like giant serpents and dragons. So it's actually pretty cool. Within Hindu and Buddhist mythology, there is a divine creature that is part human, part bird, known as the Kinara. But unlike the Harpies, their associations tend to be a lot more on the like positive side of things, because they tend to be linked to like music and love. The Kinara are actually believed to sort of come down from the Himalayas, and they keep watch over humans during times of trouble or danger. Then if you look specifically into Southeast Asian Buddhist mythology, whilst the Kinaras are usually male, they have a female counterpart known as the Kinaris, or Kinaris. Again, half bird, half woman, with the head, torso and arms of a woman, then the wings, tail and feet of a swan particularly. The Kinaris are renowned for their dancing, their song, their poetry, and they are used as a traditional symbol of like feminine beauty and grace, which I've found really fascinating because it's almost the inverse of a harpy. Because whilst the harpy mythology is not specifically related to them being women, if that makes sense, like the succubus, it's a woman, the siren, they are women, it's, you know, the gorgons, it's a woman, it's the harpies just happen to all be female, but obviously they're these like foul-natured, vicious, cruel, horrible creatures. And then the flip side of that, creatures that have the same kind of appearance, it's the complete opposite meaning. This is what I mean when I feel like I say the Greeks just hated women. But so concludes the tale of the hideous harpies. As I've thought about it, like while I've been talking, the way these are described in comparison to things like the succubus, the siren, the gorgon, it seems to lean more into the bird side. It's really hard to try and describe. They're described as the dogs of Zeus, i.e. they are just attack dogs, they're agents of punishment, they're just kind of following orders, or they're acting on this like feral base instinct, which I can see the comparison to like birds of prey and particularly like scavenger birds, because they can be seen as incredibly ruthless and quite cruel almost. They don't seem to have much like autonomy or any kind of like decision making of their own. They just seem to be following orders, which I don't know if that leans more into like the bird side of it. The animalistic part of this hybrid is the dominating part. They just so happen to look like women. I don't know, I'm trying to wrap my head around sort of what I think it means. I would love to know what you guys think. It is a very fascinating topic, to be fair. Especially, as I said, because I didn't know about all the links to like them being agents of punishment and their links to like the underworld and that kind of thing. So that was really fascinating to find out. The look that I've done, I'm not gonna lie, I really struggled to come up with a concept for this look. My brain just kept going back to like sticking feathers on my face, and I really didn't want to do that. I decided to try and take my main inspiration for this look from the harpy eagle, like the actual bird, rather than like the mythology of the harpies. It's a really odd looking bird, but it's really cool, and I think I'm happy with it. I say this every time. I was happy with it until I did the lip. It was an idea that worked in theory, but just not in practice. Let me know what you guys think of the lore. Let me know what you guys think of the look. Big thank you again to my Patreons who helped me come up with the concepts and ideas for these videos. I appreciate you all very much. As I said before, if you want to get involved in that side of things, I'll leave a link to the Patreon in the description down below. Don't forget to follow me on all of my other social medias, Instagram, TikTok, Spotify, just so you don't miss any of the random crap that I upload. But other than that, I hope you all have a fabulous day. I love and appreciate all of you very, very much. And I will see you all in the next one. Bye.